What common gardening mistakes could you be making or about to make without even realizing? And there is no shame or judgment here, just good gardening advice, because I made most of these mistakes myself when I was first starting. Because these are lessons that are often impossible to learn until you make the mistakes yourself. So if you want to help skip a couple years of gardening heartache and jump straight into being an awesome, productive home gardener, sit back, hit that full screen button, because this video will make you a better gardener. Now let's dig in. The first mistake is one that I definitely made myself, and that's starting by trying to grow in too big of a space without this one key step. Let me tell you about my first year trying to grow home veggies so that you can learn from my mistake instead of making it yourself. This was about 10 years ago. I was a poor uni student at the time, and alongside my uni course, I thought it would be a good idea to do a gourmet cookery course. And one thing I found out really quickly is that a lot of the gourmet ingredients that you need are really expensive. So I had the genius idea of trying to grow my own. Thankfully at the time, the rental that we were living in already had some huge veggie garden beds that were completely empty that I could use. Unfortunately for me, the soil in them was completely trash. Now, I was able to at least research enough about gardening at the time to realize that trying to grow something in soil pretty similar to this would be pretty impossible. But where I went wrong is I still wanted to grow in the entire bed. These beds were about 1.5 meters wide and ran the entire length of a big backyard. This was about 20 square meters of growing space. And more growing space means more veggies, right? So I really wanted to grow in all of it. But where I quickly ran into problems was when it came to budget to try and afford soil additives. And I also didn't really know much about soil additives. So all I bought at the time was 3 bags of potting mix that I then scattered super thinly across the entire bed. And then when I tried to plant seeds and seedlings into that bed, guess what? Nothing grew. And this is a mistake that I see new gardeners make time and time again. And that's trying to go for a garden space bigger than their budget permits. What you are so much better off doing as a beginner gardener is growing in a much smaller space where you can fill it with proper soil and look after it properly. You'll find a small garden, well done, is so much more productive than a large garden poorly done, especially if it has poor soil. When deciding where to plant something or even where to build a new garden bed, there is one mistake most new gardeners will make because they don't know one critical detail. So let me ask you, do you know why plants are green? If we zoom really close into the green leaf of a plant, what we see are these tiny little cells called chloroplasts. And these chloroplasts are actually the tiny little solar panels that our plants use to perform photosynthesis, which takes sunlight, some water from the ground and carbon from the air and turns it into sugar. And plants store that sugar kind of the same way that we store fat, which we then use to turn into energy, and the plants use to turn into new organs such as leaves, stems, roots, and fruit. Yeah, all the plants that we grow in the garden contain the exact same sugar that we put in our cakes and tea. It's just that the plants that we usually harvest this from, sugarcane and sugar beet, contains a bit more of it. But this leads us to one of the most interesting tidbits gardeners know, is that because the sugar has come from our sun, all the sugar that we're using in the kitchen is literally stardust. Okay, back to why this is important to us. The more sun we can give our plants, the bigger and quicker they'll grow, the bigger our harvest will be. And the big mistake that new gardeners make is putting their beds or plants in a spot that just doesn't get enough sun. And one of the reasons this is such a common issue is more often than not, the best looking place to put a garden bed is usually next to a fence or the house or under a big tree. And those are places that are usually quite shaded out through most of the day. This is not to say that the only good place to put a garden bed would be in the exact middle of our yard. But what it does mean is that we have to be smart about where we put it. Now what this does mean is that if you're like me and in the southern hemisphere, you want to try and keep your garden beds towards the southern part of your yard. This is because the sun actually comes across a slightly northern angle across the sky. And as much as possible, try and keep it slightly away from your east and west fences or housing. And as much as possible, try and avoid putting it up against the northern fence line of the house. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, reverse north and south. Now this next mistake was one of the hardest lessons to learn and accept. But when I did, it was really the definitive moment that took me from being a novice gardener into someone with a genuinely green thumb, and is the absolute key of getting your crops from being a seedling to an abundant harvest. And like I said, this one's hard to accept. So there is a saying that I say to myself nearly every day in the garden. Let me tell you the story of how I came across it. Now, I live out in country Victoria where every year bushfires are a serious threat. And thankfully we have the volunteer organisation, the CFA, Country Fire Authority, who every year give up so much of their own time to help keep bushfires under control. And one time I was at a party speaking to a member of the CFA and I asked, what were you doing today? And he said, I was out there starting fires. Because as it turns out, one of the most critical steps in bushfire prevention is starting controlled burns to remove all of the really dry fuel from the forest floor to help stop bushfires in their tracks if they were to ever come through. And the sentence that he finished his story with is what I think about every day in the garden. He said, in my firefighting career, I have started far more fires than I've put out. And I think about this a lot because the truth of being a really productive home gardener is that I kill so many more plants than I grow, especially when it comes to seedlings. You may have noticed that anytime I'm starting seeds on camera, I'm putting 2, 4, 5, 6 seeds in a single seed cell. This is because not all seeds germinate and I want to get at least one in each cell. But where beginners go wrong is they'll sometimes see 2, 3, 4 seedlings in the same seed cell and try and save them all. The reality is what we have to do is pick the strongest seedling and kill the rest. Take this tomato seed tray for example. Later in the season, I want to plant about 8 tomato plants. So I started 10 cells of them, and in each cell, I started 2 different seeds. Now, some of them have only come through with the 1 tomato, but some have come through with 2, and one's even got 3 in it. So I go through the process of choosing only the best ones, so that in each seed cell, I'm only keeping the best seedling. And then out of all 10 seed cells, I'm only gonna keep about 8 plants. And if I don't have space for the rest, I've got to accept that the other seedlings are just destined for the compost. And you have to accept that you're going to start and probably kill more plants than you end up growing. However, this can lead a lot of beginners to making the next mistake. But before we get to that, if you've enjoyed any of these tips, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. It'll help other people see it and it'll help YouTube show you other videos like it. Or if you want to see some of the big secrets that all pro gardeners know that you probably don't even know to search for, consider subscribing to my channel because I put out tons of content that is super important and interesting for new gardeners, but just never really escapes my subscriber base because they're not that optimized for the algorithm. Like my last video was an 8-minute cinematic documentary on soil microbes and their important role in our ecosystem, and they help your plants grow and they even help your plants talk to each other. Consider subscribing or just checking out that video. Seed packets lie to you, or at the very least, they're really poorly designed for the home gardener. Let me give you the missing puzzle piece that'll help you not just avoid a mistake, but make your garden so much more productive and pest resistant. When you look at the back of a seed packet, one of the first things that will jump out to you will be the recommended plant spacing. Now, what a lot of beginner gardeners don't realize is that this is the recommended spacing for farm style planting. This is not the recommendation for the home garden. For example, this broccoli is recommended to be planted 45 centimeters apart. But I have planted it less than half that apart, and this year we've gotten some ridiculously abundant harvests out of this broccoli patch. We have been giving broccoli away like crazy. Let me ask you a question, whether you're a beginner or a seasoned gardener, did your first growing experience look something like this? You start with a cheap garden bed, probably from Bunnings, you fill it full of soil, you take some seeds or seedlings and then sow those at the recommended spacing, something like in a 1 by 1 meter bed, putting 4 to 6 lettuces, and then a couple weeks later, they get absolutely dominated by pests. Don't worry, there is no shame here. We all went through it. It's because of this bad design, as well as when we think about who's the best at gardening, we probably think of farms and their long rows of planting out the same crop for entire paddocks. Well, the reality is they only do that Not because that's the most efficient way to grow produce, it's because that makes a lot of sense, the actual logistics of harvesting. What we are so much better off doing is planting everything a lot more closely together and also planting so much more diversity in our garden beds, as much as we can possibly pack in. This does a lot of things. By planting a lot denser and with a lot more diversity, we're more likely to be planting plants that are going to bring in beneficial insects that will eat a lot of our pests, as well as we're planting dense enough to create a living mulch, which will help create optimal soil conditions for microbes and, again, beneficial insects. And it will also help prevent weed seeds from germinating, both because instead of landing on the soil, they'll land on your plants, and your plants are close enough together and thriving enough to where they will be able to out-compete those weeds for the nutrients. So weeds never get a chance. A great way for beginners to start doing this is just start by overplanting, and then if it does look way too crowded, get ready to kill some plants and take them out. As well as, one of the best things that you can do for your garden is, if you do end up with little gaps in the garden, throw something in there. Throw a companion flower like a marigold or an alyssum. Chives are great. Other herbs like basil and parsley. If you're like me and you have spring onions popping up everywhere around the garden, putting little spring onions in between rows here and there will also help deter pests. And finally, this has to be the most common garden mistake. Seasoned gardeners make it all the time, so do I sometimes, but I'm about to give you some awesome tips to help you avoid it. I'm talking about overwatering and underwatering. When it comes to overwatering, it's usually not too much of an issue with in-ground plants that are already in the ground or in your garden beds, as long as you have used a well-draining soil. However, where it's a really common issue is overwatering your seedlings. Here is my method of how to learn how much water your seedlings need so that you can get this right for the rest of your life. Now, what we need to start this process is a tray that can hold water that can fit our seedling trays. And we're going to start by bottom watering. Now, even though bottom watering is a great habit to get into because it helps reduce the risk of some pests and infection that can lay on the top of our soil, the real reason that we do this is if we take some seedlings and leave them in this for half a day or a day, the soil in the seed cell will get completely saturated because the soil will wick up all of this water. But here is the key. What I want you to do is get in the habit of coming out and picking up your seed trays once they are fully saturated, and also do the same thing with trays that haven't been watered in a while. And you will start to realize the incredible difference in weight when your seedlings are actually watered and when the soil is completely dry. And you will find this is one of the most accessible and easy methods of working out when your seedlings need watering. So I haven't watered these in a couple days, but it has been raining. Do they need watering? No, because it's very heavy. To prove this point, here are two nearly identical seed cells, except one is currently living inside and getting hand watered, and the other is living outside in my normal seed area. And we've had some rain over the last couple days. And visually, they look nearly identical. To the touch, they both feel wet. There's not much else I could say about them. But if we put them on the scale, let's see the difference. The ones that I've been hand watering inside come to 214 grams. The ones that have been sitting outside in the rain, 363 grams. And when you feel them, there's a significant difference. This one feels twice as light as this one, which means that I have probably been underwatering these indoor seedlings. And the time that we're really at risk of underwatering our garden are times like through winter and early spring, when we get a lot of mist, a lot of really dewy mornings, a lot of days of light rain, and it's really easy for us to assume that because our plants are quite wet a lot of the time, that they are getting all of the water that they need. But it's pretty common that this isn't the case, especially through these times of year. But as a general habit, it's really important to get out and actually feel 10, 15 centimeters deep in your garden bed. And you will honestly be shocked how actually dry the soil can get through some parts of those seasons. So tell me, what are some of the big gardening mistakes that you made when you were first starting out? Leave them in the comments because they'll help other people. Or if there are issues that you're encountering right now, leave those as well and I'll try and help you down in the comments. If you want to learn how to build, or more importantly fill a garden bed in a really cheap but high quality way, make sure to check out this video where I show you exactly how to do that. Thank you, I'll see you next time.